The bustling airport was alive with the usual chaos. Boarding announcements echoing through the terminal, the hurried footsteps of late passengers, and the low hum of rolling suitcases. For Camille Johnson, today was supposed to be just another routine flight to visit her family. She was dressed to perfection in a sleek designer dress, the kind of outfit that turned heads but wasn't too flashy. Camille carried herself with grace, her confidence palpable as she approached the security checkpoint. What she didn't know was that this ordinary trip was about to become anything but. The TSA line seemed to stretch for miles, a slow-moving snake of impatient travelers. Camille waited patiently, occasionally glancing at her phone for updates. Behind her, an elderly couple chatted softly about their travel plans, while a young man up ahead argued with an agent about his oversized carry-on. Typical airport drama, nothing out of the ordinary, yet. As Camille finally reached the front of the line, a TSA agent stepped forward, signaling her to place her belongings on the conveyor belt. The agent's name tag read Paul, and his demeanor was far from welcoming. He eyed her up and down, his gaze lingering a moment too long. Camille felt a flicker of discomfort, but brushed it off. After all, the TSA was known for being strict. "Step through the scanner, ma'am," Paul instructed, his voice carrying an edge of authority. Camille did as she was told, raising her arms as the machine whirred around her. When she stepped out, Paul gestured for her to wait. "We've got an alert," he said, waving another agent over. Confused, Camille asked, "Is something wrong?" Paul smirked, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. "Just a routine check," he replied, his tone far from reassuring. What followed was anything but routine. Paul's behavior grew increasingly odd. He rummaged through Camille's belongings with unnecessary roughness, unfolding her neatly packed clothes and scattering them across the inspection table. Then, without warning, he zeroed in on her dress. "This fabric feels a little thick," he remarked, his smirk widening. "Could be hiding something." Before Camille could protest, Paul grabbed at the hem of her dress, tugging hard enough to rip the expensive fabric. The sound of tearing cloth echoed in the terminal, drawing gasps from nearby passengers. Camille's face burned with humiliation and anger. "Are you serious?" she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "This dress costs more than your paycheck." Paul shrugged nonchalantly. "Just doing my job," he said, though his grin suggested otherwise. The scene had escalated quickly, catching the attention of other travelers. Some pulled out their phones to record, while others whispered among themselves. Camille, now holding the torn edges of her dress together, felt a mixture of rage and helplessness. But what Paul didn't know, what no one in that terminal could have guessed, was that Camille's husband, Marcus, wasn't just any man. He was the owner of the very airport they were standing in, a fact that would soon turn this entire situation on its head. As the tension hung thick in the air, Camille reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed Marcus's number, the determination in her eyes unmistakable. Paul, oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed, leaned back against the table with a satisfied expression. The call connected, and Marcus's deep voice answered. "Hey, babe. Everything okay?" Camille took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Not even close," she replied. "You need to get down here. Now." And just like that, the stage was set for a showdown that no one in that terminal would ever forget. Marcus Johnson didn't ask any questions. He knew his wife's voice well enough to tell when something was seriously wrong. Camille was a calm, composed woman, not one to get rattled easily. For her to call him in the middle of a flight preparation with that tone meant trouble. "I'm on my way," he said firmly, grabbing his car keys from his desk. Marcus wasn't the kind of man to leave things unresolved, especially when it came to his wife. As the owner of the airport, he often dealt with high-stakes decisions and major operational issues. But nothing hit home like this. He had poured years of hard work into building his business empire, ensuring that his ventures were run with precision and respect. To hear that something, or someone, had crossed a line with Camille stirred a fire inside him. Back at the security checkpoint, Camille stood stiffly near the inspection table, her torn dress still clutched together at the seams. The onlookers had grown in number, their murmurs creating a low buzz that filled the air. Some whispered words of sympathy, while others stared wide-eyed, phones in hand, documenting every moment. Camille's cheeks burned, not from embarrassment anymore, but from anger. Paul, meanwhile, leaned casually against the inspection table, clearly enjoying the attention. "Relax," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're acting like it's the end of the world. It's just a dress." "Just a dress," Camille repeated, her voice icy. "You have no idea what you've done." Another TSA agent approached, a younger woman with an uneasy expression. "Paul, maybe we should call a supervisor," she said quietly, glancing at Camille. Paul waved her off. "No need. I've got this under control." Camille's phone buzzed in her hand, and she saw Marcus's name flash across the screen. She stepped away from the table, holding the phone to her ear. "Where are you?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. "2 minutes away," Marcus replied. "Stay where you are. Don't let anyone else touch you or your things." As she hung up, Camille noticed that Paul's smirk had faltered slightly. Maybe it was the way she held herself now, no longer a victim, but a woman ready to fight back. Or maybe it was the quiet authority in her voice as she spoke on the phone. Either way, the change in his demeanor was subtle but noticeable. Nearby, a family of 4 looked on, the mother shaking her head in disapproval. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, loud enough for Camille to hear. "Why can't they treat people with respect?" Camille met the woman's eyes briefly, grateful for the silent show of solidarity. But her focus remained on the agent who had caused all this. "Paul," she said sharply, drawing his attention back to her. "What's your badge number?" He blinked, caught off guard. "My what?" "Your badge number," she repeated, her tone unyielding. "I'm reporting this incident, and I'll need your identification." Paul straightened up, the smirk returning as if he were regaining his footing. "Go ahead," he said with a shrug. "File your little complaint. It won't go anywhere." Camille didn't respond, but the intensity in her gaze was enough to make him shift uncomfortably. Outside, Marcus pulled into the airport's executive entrance, his face set in a grim expression. He barely acknowledged the greetings from staff members as he made his way toward the security area. As he approached, he could see the commotion from a distance. A small crowd gathered, phones out and Camille standing at the center of it all. When Marcus stepped into the scene, his presence was like a lightning bolt. He was tall, well-dressed, and carried an air of authority that immediately commanded attention. The crowd seemed to part instinctively, their murmurs fading into silence. Camille's shoulders relaxed ever so slightly when she saw him. "Marcus," she said, relief and resolve mingling in her voice. He walked straight to her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. When he saw the tear in her dress, his jaw tightened. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low but filled with concern. "I am now," she replied, glancing briefly at Paul. Marcus turned to the TSA agent, his expression unreadable. "Are you the one who did this?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with steel. Paul hesitated, clearly unsure of how to respond. "Sir, I was just following protocol." The supervisor's nervousness was hard to miss. It wasn't every day that the owner of the airport showed up in the middle of a security incident, and certainly not under circumstances like these. He adjusted his tie and stepped closer to Marcus, clearly trying to salvage the situation. "Mr. Johnson, I deeply apologize for any inconvenience your wife has experienced," the supervisor began, his tone overly polite. "Let me assure you, we take matters like this very seriously." Marcus's expression didn't soften. His focus remained fixed on Paul, who was now shifting uneasily from foot to foot. "I'm not interested in apologies," Marcus said firmly. "I want accountability. I want to know why my wife was singled out, why her property was damaged, and why this man thought it was acceptable to treat her this way." The crowd, which had grown even larger, was eerily quiet now. People were hanging on to every word, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Camille stood beside Marcus, her posture strong despite the torn fabric she still held together. Paul finally spoke, his voice defensive. "Look, I didn't single anyone out. She went through the scanner and it flagged her. I was doing my job." Marcus's sharp gaze didn't waver. "Doing your job doesn't include humiliating passengers or destroying their belongings," he said. "And don't think for a second that I believe this was random." The supervisor interjected hastily, trying to de-escalate the situation. "Perhaps we can move this conversation to a more private setting," he suggested, glancing nervously at the onlookers. "No," Camille said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension. "This happened publicly, and I'm not going to let it be swept under the rug." Her words seemed to embolden some of the bystanders. A man near the front of the crowd called out, "She's right. This kind of thing happens way too often. It's about time someone stands up to it." Others murmured in agreement, their voices growing louder. The energy in the room shifted as people began to share their own stories of unfair treatment at airports. Some spoke of lost items, others of unnecessary delays, and a few mentioned feeling targeted for reasons they couldn't explain. The young female TSA agent who had earlier suggested calling a supervisor stepped forward, her expression conflicted. "Sir," she said hesitantly, addressing Marcus. I think there's something you should know." Paul shot her a warning look, but she continued anyway. "This isn't the first time we've had complaints about Agent Paul. There have been incidents before." The supervisor's face turned a shade paler. "That's not relevant right now," he said quickly, trying to regain control of the narrative. "It's entirely relevant," Marcus said, his tone sharp. "If this man has a history of misconduct, I want to know about it, and I want to know why he's still working here." The tension in the room was palpable. Paul's earlier bravado had all but disappeared, replaced by a nervous defensiveness. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "You're all blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" Marcus countered, his voice calm but cold. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've made a habit of abusing your position. And today, you made the mistake of targeting the wrong person." The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air. Even those who didn't know his full identity could sense the authority behind them. Meanwhile, Camille's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen and saw a flood of messages from friends and acquaintances who had already seen videos of the incident circulating online. It was spreading quickly, and the hashtags were piling up. #AirportJustice, #TSA Abuse, #StandWithCamille. She showed the screen to Marcus, who nodded. "Good," he said. "Let the world see what's happening here." The supervisor, now visibly sweating, tried again to regain control. "Mr. Johnson, I assure you we will launch a full investigation into this matter. Agent Paul will be placed on administrative leave while we review the footage and reports." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "That's not good enough," he said. "I want immediate action. I want a formal apology to my wife. And I want a complete overhaul of the way your agents are trained and supervised." If I don't see those changes, I'll make sure the TSA's presence in this airport is reevaluated. The supervisor's eyes widened in alarm. Losing their contract with the airport would be a disaster, and he knew it. Understood, he said quickly. We'll make this right. Paul, realizing the gravity of his situation, attempted to plead his case. This is all a misunderstanding, he said, his voice desperate now. I didn't mean any harm. Camille looked at him, her expression unreadable. Maybe you didn't, she said quietly. But your actions have consequences. And today, you're going to face them. As Marcus and Camille walked away, the buzz of the crowd followed them. The energy around the checkpoint was electric, fueled by a mix of outrage and curiosity. While Marcus's calm authority had quelled the immediate chaos, it was clear that the situation had sparked something much larger. People weren't just angry for Camille, they were angry for themselves. For every time they'd felt powerless in a system designed to control and intimidate. Camille held her head high as they moved toward a quieter part of the terminal, but inside, her emotions churned. She glanced at Marcus, who was already texting his legal team, his expression focused and unyielding. For all of his outward calm, she knew him well enough to sense the storm brewing beneath. Marcus, she said softly, breaking the silence between them. This isn't just about me anymore. He looked up from his phone, his brow furrowing. What do you mean? She gestured vaguely behind them, where the crowd was still dispersing. Did you hear them? This is happening to so many people. If we just walk away now, it's like saying it's okay for this to keep happening. Marcus stopped walking, turning to face her fully. We're not walking away, he said firmly. But we need to handle this the right way. If we let emotions drive this, we'll lose control of the narrative. Camille nodded, understanding but still feeling the weight of the moment. Then let's make sure the narrative is about more than just us, she said. Before Marcus could respond, his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and frowned. It's the TSA regional director, he said, answering quickly. This should be interesting. Camille listened as Marcus's tone shifted into something sharper, more professional. The conversation was short, with Marcus doing most of the talking. By the time he hung up, his expression had darkened. They're scrambling, he said, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Apparently, word has already reached their higher-ups, and they're worried about the backlash. Good, Camille said. They should be. They want to meet, Marcus added. Today. Camel's stomach tightened. What do you think they're going to say? Damage control, Marcus replied bluntly. They'll apologize, promise to investigate, maybe even throw Paul under the bus. But that's not enough. She nodded, her resolve hardening. Then we'll make sure they know that. As they waited for the meeting to be arranged, Camille's phone continued to buzz with notifications. The videos of the incident were gaining traction online, with comments pouring in from all sides. Some people expressed outrage and solidarity, while others criticized the TSA's handling of security. A few skeptics tried to downplay the situation, but they were quickly drowned out by the overwhelming support for Camille. One comment caught her eye. Asterisk, if this can happen to someone like her, imagine what they do to people who can't fight back. Asterisk. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She thought about the countless travelers who didn't have the resources, the platform, or the confidence to stand up for themselves. The elderly woman she'd seen earlier, the young man with the oversized carry-on, the families just trying to get through their trips. How many of them had been mistreated and silenced? Marcus, she said suddenly, I want to hear from them. He looked at her, confused. From who? Everyone, she said, holding up her phone. The people who've been through this, I want to know their stories. If we're going to do this, we need to make it about more than just us. He considered her words for a moment, then nodded. All right, he said, let's start collecting them. With Marcus's support, Camille posted a video of her own. Standing in the quiet corner of the terminal, she spoke directly to the camera, her voice steady but passionate. She recounted the incident, not just as a personal grievance, but as part of a larger problem. This isn't just about me, she said, her eyes fierce. This is about all of us who've been made to feel small, powerless, and dehumanized. If you have a story, share it. Let's make sure they hear us. The response was immediate. Within minutes, stories began flooding in. Travelers from all walks of life shared their experiences, some heartbreaking, others infuriating. The common thread was the feeling of helplessness, the sense that they had no choice but to endure. As the stories poured in, Camille felt her anger transform into something stronger. Purpose. This wasn't just about holding Paul accountable or even reforming TSA practices. It was about standing up for dignity and respect, about demanding change for everyone who had ever been mistreated. The air in the conference room felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. Camille's words lingered, creating a stillness that dared anyone to break it. Marcus leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers interlaced, waiting for the officials to respond. The TSA regional director looked visibly uncomfortable, his forehead glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. Mrs. Johnson, he began cautiously, choosing his words with precision. We understand your frustration, and I assure you, we share your commitment to making this right. Implementing systemic changes, however, is a process. These things take time. Camille met his gaze without flinching. Time, she repeated, her voice calm but firm. How much more time do you think people should wait to be treated with basic human decency? How many more stories need to come out before someone decides to act? The director hesitated, as though trying to find an answer that would satisfy her. But Marcus cut in, his voice cool and steady. What my wife is asking, he said, is whether you're prepared to actually address the root of the problem, or if you're just going to offer us vague promises and hope this blows over. The other officials in the room shifted uncomfortably. One of them, the airport's head of security, finally spoke up. With all due respect, Mr. Johnson, changes of this scale require careful planning. Training programs, oversight protocols, these things can't be implemented overnight. Marcus's expression didn't waver. I didn't ask for overnight. I asked for commitment, he said. And judging by what I've seen so far, that's the one thing you seem to be avoiding. The regional director leaned forward, clearly trying to salvage the conversation. We are committed, he insisted, his tone tinged with desperation. But this isn't just about one airport or one agent. It's a nationwide system, and making changes at that level requires coordination with federal agencies. And while you're coordinating, Camille said, her voice sharp, what happens to the people who are still being mistreated? What happens to the next person who ends up like me? Her words cut through the room like a blade. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Marcus leaned forward, his tone measured but unrelenting. Let me make something clear, he said. This isn't going away. Not today, not next week, not ever. If you think you can ride out the backlash and go back to business as usual, you're mistaken. The director's face paled slightly, but he didn't respond. Camille glanced at Marcus, then back at the officials. The stories are already out there, she said, holding up her phone. People are watching, and they're not going to stop. You don't get to control the narrative anymore. Outside the conference room, the ripple effects of the incident were still spreading. Social media was ablaze with conversations about the treatment of travelers at airports. The video of Camille's torn dress had gone viral, sparking debates and drawing attention from news outlets. Some reporters were already gathering at the terminal, eager to capture the story as it unfolded. Meanwhile, inside the room, the tension continued to build. The director rubbed his temples, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he sighed heavily and looked directly at Marcus. "What do you want from us?" he asked, his tone almost resigned. Marcus exchanged a glance with Camille before replying. "We want transparency," he said. "We want to see your training materials, your incident reports, and your disciplinary records. We want to know exactly how you're holding your agents accountable." "And we want action," Camille added. "Not promises. Action." The officials exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could respond, Marcus's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen and frowned. "Excuse me," he said, stepping outside to take the call. Camille watched him leave, her stomach twisting with nerves. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the enormity of what they were trying to accomplish. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel powerless, everyone who had ever been silenced. When Marcus returned, his expression was unreadable. He leaned down to whisper something in Camille's ear, his voice low enough that the others couldn't hear. Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she nodded, her jaw tightening with resolve. Marcus straightened, his gaze sweeping across the room. "You have until the end of the day to give us a concrete plan," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "If we don't see real progress, we'll escalate this. And believe me, you don't want that." The officials looked visibly shaken, but no one dared to argue. As Marcus and Camille walked out of the room, the tension followed them, hanging heavy in the air. Camille glanced at Marcus, her heart pounding. "What was that call about?" she asked quietly. Marcus's expression was grim. "It's bigger than we thought," he said. "And it's not just Paul." Camille's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before answering. Someone leaked internal reports. "There's a pattern, complaints, cover-ups, retaliation against passengers who speak out. It's a mess, Camille. And now it's all coming to light." Her mind raced, the implications hitting her like a freight train. This wasn't just a fight against one bad agent or one broken system. This was a reckoning, and they were at the center of it. As the day wore on, Marcus and Camille returned to the airport's main terminal, where the energy was palpable. Reporters with microphones hovered near security checkpoints, snapping pictures and filming segments. Passengers paused mid-step, their phones raised, documenting the scene. The story had grown beyond anything either of them could have imagined, and the weight of it pressed heavily on their shoulders. Marcus's phone buzzed incessantly, each new notification piling on another layer of urgency. Camille glanced over his shoulder as he skimmed through messages. One in particular caught their attention. A legal advisor had uncovered something critical. Camille's stomach clenched as Marcus read aloud, a whistleblower. An agent willing to speak out about Paul and others. They're ready to testify, but only if they feel protected. Camille exhaled sharply. "This could change everything," she said. "But how do we protect them?" "If they're scared enough to ask for safety, that means whatever they know is serious." Marcus nodded grimly. "We'll need to involve the media," he said. "Get everything out in the open before anyone can shut it down." Moments later, the TSA regional director called, his tone clipped and urgent. "Mr. Johnson, we've drafted a plan. If you'd be willing to meet again, we'd like to go over it with you and your wife." Marcus agreed, but Camille noticed a flicker of doubt in his eyes as he hung up. "Do you think they're trying to stall?" she asked quietly. "Maybe," he admitted. But if they are, we'll be ready. The two of them returned to the same conference room as before. The atmosphere was colder now, the officials more guarded. The regional director slid a folder across the table, its contents detailing proposed changes to training programs, stricter oversight policies, and immediate disciplinary measures for violations. On the surface, it looked promising, comprehensive even. But Marcus's sharp eyes scanned the pages with a practiced precision, and Camille could see his jaw tighten. "This is performative," he said flatly, tossing the folder onto the table. "You're dressing this up to look good for the public, but there's no real accountability here. No timelines. No concrete consequences." The director shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We're open to feedback," he said weakly. Camille leaned forward, her voice cutting through the room like steel. "Do you think we came here to play nice? This isn't about making tweaks to your policies. It's about dismantling a culture of abuse and rebuilding trust. And if you're not willing to do that, we will." The director opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Marcus's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and stood abruptly. "We need to step out," he said, pulling Camille with him. In the hallway, away from prying ears, Marcus showed Camille the text. It was from the whistleblower, a TSA agent named Lisa. She had just emailed a trove of internal documents detailing years of misconduct, including names, dates, and cover-ups. But the real bombshell was at the bottom of the message. Asterisk Paul wasn't acting alone. "This goes all the way to the top asterisk." Camel's breath caught. "The top," she whispered. "You mean the regional director." "Higher," Marcus said grimly. "This implicates national leadership. They've known about these abuses for years and did nothing." The revelation hit them like a thunderclap. This wasn't just a local issue, it was systemic, deeply entrenched, and far-reaching. Marcus wasted no time forwarding the documents to trusted journalists and legal allies, knowing they would amplify the truth. As the hours ticked by, the story exploded. News outlets ran with the leaked documents, broadcasting headlines that sent shockwaves across the country. Camille and Marcus watched from a quiet corner of the terminal as passengers gathered around TV screens, their faces a mix of shock and anger. The TSA scrambled to respond, issuing a statement condemning the misconduct and promising an independent investigation. But the damage was done. Just when it seemed the climax had peaked, the unexpected twist came. Marcus received an anonymous call. The voice on the other end was low and urgent. "Be careful," it said. "There are people who don't want this to come out. They'll do whatever it takes to bury it." Marcus's blood ran cold. He tried to press the caller for more information, but they hung up abruptly. He turned to Camille, his expression dark. "We're not just up against a broken system," he said. "We're up against people who are willing to protect it at any cost." Camille felt a shiver run down her spine. The stakes had just escalated, and the battle was far from over. But as she looked into Marcus's determined eyes, she knew one thing for certain. They wouldn't back down. Not now, not ever. They had come too far to turn back, and the fight for justice had only just begun. The anonymous call lingered in Marcus's mind long after it ended. He and Camille knew the stakes were higher than they'd anticipated, but there was no turning back now. They had become the voice for so many others who had been silenced or ignored, and their fight was bigger than themselves. As the hours unfolded, it became clear that the story had spiraled beyond anyone's control. The leaked documents, the viral video of Camille's dress, and the wave of whistleblowers coming forward had created a storm no one could ignore. By evening, the Department of Homeland Security announced an emergency press conference. Camille and Marcus sat in their living room, the television casting a soft glow as they listened intently. A spokesperson stood at the podium, looking visibly tense. The recent revelations about systemic misconduct within the TSA are deeply troubling, the spokesperson began. We take these allegations seriously and have launched an independent investigation into the actions of TSA leadership at all levels. Effective immediately, several officials, including the regional director, have been placed on administrative leave pending the results of this investigation. Camille let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't the sweeping change they'd hoped for, but it was a start. Marcus, however, remained stoic, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "This is just damage control," he said. "They're trying to get ahead of the story before it gets worse." He wasn't wrong. The government's response, while swift, felt calculated. But something had shifted. For the first time, there was a crack in the armor, and the truth was beginning to shine through. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Camille and Marcus were inundated with requests for interviews, invitations to speak on panels, and messages from people who had their own stories to share. Camille found herself answering emails late into the night, her heart heavy with the weight of so many voices seeking justice. One email in particular stood out. It was from Lisa, the whistleblower. "Thank you for giving me the courage to speak out," it read. "I was scared to come forward, but seeing your bravery reminded me why it matters. This fight isn't over, but at least we're not alone." Camille read the message aloud to Marcus, her voice trembling with emotion. "We're making a difference," she said, wiping away a tear. "Even if it feels like an uphill battle, we're not doing this for nothing." Marcus nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "We've done what we can," he said. "Now it's up to the system to decide if it's willing to change." Weeks turned into months, and the investigation gained momentum. Camille and Marcus stayed involved, attending hearings and lending their voices to the growing movement for accountability. The TSA rolled out a series of immediate reforms, including mandatory training on bias and the implementation of independent oversight committees. While far from perfect, the changes marked a significant step forward. One morning, as Camille sipped her coffee and scrolled through the news, she came across an article about Paul. The former agent had been terminated and was now under investigation for multiple allegations of misconduct. Camille felt a sense of closure, knowing that his actions would no longer go unchecked. But more than that, she felt hope that others like him would finally face the consequences of their behavior. As the chaos began to settle, Camille and Marcus found themselves reflecting on the journey they'd been through. They had never intended to become activists, yet their story had sparked a national conversation about power, accountability, and the importance of standing up for what's right. One evening, as they sat together on their patio, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Marcus turned to Camille with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we'll ever know the full impact of what we did?" he asked. Camille smiled softly, her gaze fixed on the vibrant hues of the sky. "Maybe not," she admitted. "But that's okay. It's not about knowing. It's about believing that we've planted seeds. And one day, those seeds will grow into something bigger than us." The sound of their children's laughter echoed from the yard, a reminder of why they had fought so hard. They wanted to leave the world better than they'd found it, not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after them. As the months turned into years, the memory of that fateful day at the airport remained vivid in their minds. It was a turning point, a moment that had tested their resilience and reshaped their purpose. But it was also a reminder of the power of courage, compassion, and the unwavering belief that change is possible. In the end, Camille and Marcus didn't see themselves as heroes. They were simply people who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. And while the road to change was long and winding, they knew one thing for certain: they would never stop walking it.